Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. From time to time, I mention the fact that in YouTube's analytics that are available to those of us with channels, we can see what our audience is watching. Not individually, like I can't go in and see what videos you individually watched, but I can see overall people who watch my channel, what else are they watching? And this one showed up big time in the last couple of days. And I know that it's been inspired by other videos of this type, and we did one a while back from another channel, but it's from Casual Lectures, and he seems to have kind of modeled his art style off of Salmonella, historical facts that mess with your perception of time. And I did look at his kind of chapters here, and I see that some of these are similar to another video I did a couple years ago on this topic. So there might be some overlap here, but you guys are watching this video in droves, and so I thought I would take a look at it. I'll put the link down in the description to the original content if you want to check it out without my commentary. Big shout out to Michael in Kermit, Texas. And Will in Carrollton, Texas. Thank you guys so much for your support through Patreon. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Events into perspective, we often simplistically divide things into old days and modern times because our brains can often struggle with the perception of time. I compiled a series of interesting facts on historical events that surprisingly took place at more or less the same time, turning them into real and pretty fascinating coincidences, and will make you think twice about how you perceive the past.
Now, one thing, even before he gets into these, that I just want to point out, because I think this is kind of interesting. I've really been kind of into Egyptian history lately, and in the back of my mind, I'm wondering how I can make a trip to Egypt happen at some point, because I think that would be an amazing trip to document for the channel. But I love that they're showing, I'm assuming this is the Great Pyramid, and it looks like you can kind of see Cairo in the background there. But, of course, the pyramid doesn't look like that. It's all smooth here, but that's how it was actually made. It originally kind of had smooth stones on the outside. I think it was limestone, and then it was capped with, some people say gold, some people say different things. We don't really know for sure, but it did look like that when it was made.
Fascinating coincidences, and will make you think twice about how you perceive the past. Number 1. The same tortoise belonged to both Charles Darwin and Steve Irwin.
That doesn't surprise me.
Harriet the tortoise was reportedly collected by Charles Darwin during his 1835 visit to the Galapagos Islands as part of his round-the-world survey expedition, then transported to England and then brought to her final home, Australia, by a retiring captain of the Beagle, the ship Darwin used for his expedition. And as we all know, tortoises can live quite a long time, and by a hilarious turn of events, Harriet turned up in Steve Irwin's zoo. That's right, the pet tortoise of Charles Darwin was adopted by the legendary crocodile hunter. However, some doubt was cast on this story by the fact that Darwin had never visited the island that Harriet originally came from. Anyhow, she had an estimated age of 175 by the time she finally died at Steve Irwin's zoo. Number 2.
Interesting. So I want to take a look at this one a little deeper because that has me thinking about something here. So the current oldest confirmed creature on Earth, animal of any kind, is Jonathan the tortoise, who is unfortunately now blind and has lost his sense of smell. But he lives on St. Helena, which you might be familiar with as the island that Napoleon Bonaparte died on. So we know for sure that he was born, I think, in 1832. And he's still alive as of now. So fascinating stuff. 190 years old. To put Jonathan's age into perspective, when Queen Elizabeth, who's now passed away, when her great-grandmother, so now King Charles's great-great-grandmother, ascended to the throne in 1837, Jonathan the tortoise was already 5 years old. So that kind of puts it in perspective a little bit. Crazy.
Today's oldest living tree was already 1,000 years old when the last woolly mammoth died. The world's oldest tree is a Great Basin bristlecone pine located in White Mountains, California, and is dated at around 5,000 years old. To put that into perspective, isolated populations of woolly mammoths on Wrangel Island didn't finally go extinct until 4,000 years ago.
Woolly mammoths are one that actually show up in a lot of lists like this because people don't realize that woolly mammoths were still alive until, about 3,500 years ago. So you can kind of use them in a lot of these.
A small island in the Arctic Ocean serving as a sanctuary for the great beasts after they were forced from the mainland by humans and climate change. Number 3. Woolly mammoths were still alive while Egyptians were building the pyramids. I think this fact is more popular nowadays, but I still want to include it, since it's a true classic. Scientists have determined that woolly mammoths were still roaming the Earth until about 1650 BC. Meanwhile, the oldest of the Great Pyramids in Egypt, the Pyramid of Djoser, was constructed between 2630 BC and 2611 BC, meaning that
The Pyramid of Djoser. So typically when we talk about the Great Pyramids, we're talking about those three iconic ones right outside of Cairo, right, in Giza. But the biggest of those three, the Great Pyramid, was Khufu, or sometimes called Cheops, depending on the translation you're looking at. So I'm not sure which one he's referring to there. But yeah, my favorite one when it comes to the pyramids, though, is talking about how Cleopatra lived closer to today than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid, which was around 2600 BC.
while man was busy building some of the most incredible structures ever made, woolly mammoths were still doing their thing. Number 4. Mahatma Gandhi and Jack the Ripper.
Where's he going with
Gandhi
this?
is so bound up with the titanic events of the 20th century that it might be peculiar to imagine him as a dapper gentleman of Victorian society. But that's exactly what he became while studying law in London, arriving in September 1888, right in the midst of the Jack the Ripper killings. Gandhi obviously had nothing to do with the Jack the Ripper killing.
Well, he couldn't have, because if he arrived in September of 1888, he arrived after the first murder had taken place in August of that year.
But it's funny to think about the fact that Gandhi could have become a suspect in the most famous murder case. Number 5. Nintendo was founded
This one I've
when
seen
Jack
before.
the Ripper was still on the loose. Even though Jack the Ripper and Nintendo were around during the same time, he never got the chance to play classics like Zelda and Mario. They originally made playing cards called Hanafuda, and the company was founded way back in 1889 when the infamous Jack the Ripper was creating havoc on the streets of London. His murder spree happened only about a year before Nintendo came into existence.
And this particular letter they're showing there, I've done videos on Jack the Ripper, so I don't want to dive too deep into this, but many of you know that this is a topic I'm very interested in. I wrote a research paper on it back in high school. That particular letter they're showing there is the one that is believed most likely to be from the killer. We don't know for sure if it was, but there are a lot of other ones we know were not, including the one that was signed Jack the Ripper that kind of gave him that name, was almost certainly written by a newspaper guy that was trying to drum up interest to keep the story in the papers and selling a lot of papers. But this particular one was sent to a guy named Mr. Lusk, who was the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which was a vigilante organization that was kind of patrolling the streets trying to help catch the killer. And it was sent with the piece of a kidney that was claimed to have been from Catherine Eddowes, who was missing one of her kidneys. And so it's possible. There was a lot of spelling mistakes, and the grammar was kind of weird, and it was not signed Jack the Ripper. It was signed Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk.
Number 6. Star Wars came out
Yeah.
the same year as the last guillotine execution in France. When thinking about guillotine executions, our minds wander to historic figures like Napoleon, but this form of execution isn't that old.
Now, I noticed he did something there. The first time he pronounced it guillotine, but then he said guillotine. I'm guilty of the same thing. I know that, like a lot of words, there's a French pronunciation, and then there's the way that Americans and others might pronounce it. But yeah, I'm not surprised.
Star Wars premiered in the United States on May 25th, 1977. At the same time, this futuristic sci-fi was wowing audiences around the world. The medieval practice of death by guillotine was still taking place in France, where Hamida pimp killer Jandoubi was beheaded for the torture and murder of a young woman.
Now, I will point this out. I mean, he said the medieval practice, but the guillotine was late 1700s, so that's not medieval. Depending on who you ask, most people are going to date the medieval period to the 15th century at the latest. Some people will point to the fall of Constantinople as the end. Some will say 1485, which today is the anniversary of the Battle of Bosworth, as the end, at least in England. But I will say this: there was the guillotine was not the first device of that kind to be built. The Scottish were using one called the Maiden that goes back much earlier, does go back to medieval times.
This was the last use of the guillotine in France. Nobody else has been executed using any means since. So technically, it is possible that people were talking about the upcoming Star Wars movie while watching the last guillotine execution.
That's true.
Number 7. You could take the London Underground to the last public hanging in the UK. We continue on with the topic of public executions, but we travel to Britain. Hanging used to be a common punishment in the UK and wasn't abolished until 1868. Michael Barrett was the last to be executed in this manner in Newgate Prison, London,
Newgate.
in front of a large crowd of people.
So Newgate Prison is, there's actually still a justice center there. It's actually really close to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And it's also right next to the spot where, at Smithfield, where William Wallace was hanged, drawn, and quartered. For a long time, they did executions there at Smithfield for a long time. Then they moved them all over to Tyburn, which is much closer over toward like Westminster and that part of London. And then they moved it back over to Newgate Prison.
5 years earlier, in 1863, the first journey of the London Underground took place. With a station in operation close by the Newgate Prison, it is entirely feasible that many Londoners would take the tube to go and watch somebody get hanged. What a very convenient situation.
Crazy.
Number 8. Prisoners arrived at Auschwitz just days after McDonald's was founded. While McDonald's is traditionally associated with the good times and affluence of 1950s America, the very first restaurant was opened much earlier, on May 15th, 1940. At the same time, one of the most gruesome events in human history began in Europe. Just 5 days after McDonald's grand opening, the first prisoners arrived at the Auschwitz concentration camp in what is now Poland. Number 9.
So McDonald's initially was founded by the McDonald brothers, and there's actually a really interesting movie about that starring Michael Keaton as Ray Kroc, because Ray Kroc's the guy who's credited with being kind of the founder of McDonald's. He didn't found McDonald's. He bought McDonald's from the McDonald brothers and turned it into a franchise that spread all over the world, but at the time was just kind of a local family restaurant.
9. The fax machine was invented the same year the first wagon crossed the Oregon Trail.
Though.
We all know the story of the Oregon Trail since it's an important part of American history. However, what many don't know is that at the same time the first wagon traversed this trail, an important technological milestone was achieved. The original fax machine, the electric printing telegraph, was patented in 1843 by Scottish inventor Alexander Bain. The same year that about 1,000 people set off west for Oregon, forming a huge wagon train.
It's not a fax machine the way we know it today. A lot of inventions that we know today had a kind of precursor. Like a lot of people will tell you that the computer was invented, hundreds of years ago. And that's technically true, depending on your definition of the word computer. But it wasn't a computer like the one I'm recording on right now. The fax machine in 1843 was not the thing that could send an exact facsimile of a piece of paper. Like if I had a drawing and I fed it through a machine and it would print out the drawing on the other side. No, it was just an electric device that could print out what you had typed into it. And so same thing with the cell phone. Some people argue the cell phone was invented in the 1970s. Other people say it was invented in the 1940s. It depends on how you define what a cell phone is.
10. Oxford University existed for hundreds of years before the Aztec Empire was founded.
A lot of things did.
The Aztec Empire began as an alliance of 3 Nahuatl city-states. These 3 city-states ruled the area in and around the Valley of Mexico from 1428 until the combined forces of the Spanish conquistadors and their native allies under Hernan Cortez defeated them in 1521.
I always thought this one was kind of weird, and I've seen this same one referred to before. Sometimes we just compare really weird things. I don't know why. I mean, I think anybody who knows much about Oxford University knows that it's really super old. And I guess maybe they're just playing on the fact that they figure people don't think universities are that old, or that they think that the Aztecs existed for thousands of years or something. I don't know. And again, this depends on how you define the Aztec Empire, right? Because the Aztecs obviously existed before they joined together as one group, one empire.
Aztec culture had rich and complex mythological and religious traditions, as well as achieving remarkable architectural and artistic accomplishments. Meanwhile, in England, Oxford University was already well established. It has no known date of foundation, but there is evidence of teaching as far back as 1096, making it the oldest university in the English-speaking world and the world's second oldest university in continuous operation.
Which is kind of funny to say the oldest university in the English-speaking world, because at the time it was founded, they weren't really speaking English, at least not the way we understand it today. Like, I couldn't go back in time to the year 1100 and carry on a conversation with someone at Oxford University, because we wouldn't be able to understand each other. It would be like a different language.
It grew rapidly from 1167 when Henry II banned English students from attending the University of Paris. Number 11. Harvard University didn't offer calculus classes for the first few years after the school was established. Modern calculus was developed in 17th century Europe by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who independently of each other first published their findings around the same time. But elements of it appeared in ancient Greece, then in China and the Middle East. And
listen, I say this all the time. Anybody who comes up with an idea, a concept, an invention, they're building off the work of other people. Nobody completely develops. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. There are certain times that things are developed completely from scratch. But everybody's building off the work of other people. There's nothing new about that.
And still later again in medieval Europe and in India. Harvard was established in 1636 and is the United States' oldest institution of higher learning, and its history, influence, and wealth have made it one of the world's most prestigious universities. Calculus was off the curriculum for the first few years for obvious reasons. It hadn't been recognized yet. I find it astonishing that the oldest university in the United States is even older than such an important scientific breakthrough. Number 12. Ecstasy was invented the same year the Titanic sank.
Interesting.
The unsinkable Titanic sank in 1912, going down in the North Atlantic Ocean 4 days into the ship's maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City. In the same year, pharmaceutical giant Merck was interested in developing substances that stopped abnormal bleeding, and one of its chemists, Anton Kolisch, synthesized MDMA to avoid a patent by German rival Bayer. The drug was of no particular interest to Merck at the time, and they only came back to research the substance sporadically over the next few years. It wasn't until 1975 that psychoactive effects of the drug began to be taken seriously, and recreational use spread thereafter through personal networks of psychotherapists, psychiatrists, users of psychedelics, and yuppies. So yes, everyone who died on the Titanic never got the chance to taste this drug.
But psychedelic drugs have been around for a long, long time. Back in the Victorian era, people would take very small doses of arsenic as a psychedelic drug. It acted a lot like LSD in small doses. The problem with arsenic addiction was that the withdrawal would kill you very often. So once you started on arsenic as a psychedelic drug, as something to treat whatever it was that you were facing, you couldn't stop. And a very famous case of this is James Maybrick, who was a Liverpool cotton merchant who has been accused of being Jack the Ripper because they found this diary, and I got into all of that during the Jack the Ripper videos that I did. But James Maybrick died as a result of arsenic withdrawal because he was doing that. And his wife who had been having an affair and was much younger than him, was convicted of his murder because of the arsenic poisoning. Here, he had been taking it himself. And she was eventually freed many years later, but it was a scandalous trial at the time.
Number 13. Microsoft was founded while Spain was still a fascist dictatorship. A highly controversial figure within Spain, Franco is seen as a divisive leader. Supporters credit his strong anti-communist and nationalist views, economic policies, preservation of traditional Spanish practices, and support of the monarchy of Spain as positive influences over the nation. Critics disparage him as an autocratic dictator who violently suppressed opposition and dissent, banned culture seen as non-Spanish, used concentration camps and forced labor, and provided much support to the Axis powers during World War II. Franco ruled Spain as a fascist state up until his death in 1975, aged 82. This was the same year that Microsoft was founded by Paul Allen and Bill Gates, and the beginning of a new era in computer technology.
I always thought that one was kind of weird too. Like, I guess maybe they're just figuring that people didn't realize that fascism continued to exist after World War II, that it was kind of a mid-20th century thing, and I don't know.
14. Artist Pablo Picasso died in 1973.
That one doesn't really surprise me either.
Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon was released. Pablo Picasso is regarded as one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. Among his most famous works are the Proto-Cubist Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, and
He may have been taking some of that ecstasy when he was painting the things that he did.
1937, a dramatic portrayal of the bombing of Guernica by the German and Italian air forces during the Spanish Civil War. Unlike some other great artists who died young, Picasso lived a long and full life until he passed away in 1973, which was, coincidentally, the same year that one of the most groundbreaking and progressive albums ever was released.
I mean, you could also argue then that Pablo Picasso was still alive when Bohemian Rhapsody came out, because that came out in the early 1970s.
Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. With an estimated 45 million copies sold, it is Pink Floyd's most successful album and one of the best-selling worldwide. It has been remastered and re-released several times and covered in its entirety by several acts. It produced 2 singles, Money and Us and Them, and is often regarded as one of the greatest albums of all time. I would love to play you some pieces of this album, but that would most likely end with the takedown of this video. But
Yeah.
Let's be real, if anyone here doesn't know Dark Side of the Moon, you are more in need of a lesson in culture than in history.
Random fun fact for you. I missed one day of high school. I had perfect attendance my freshman, sophomore, and junior years of high school. Never missed a day. I missed one day my senior year, and it was to go to a Pink Floyd concert at the old Cleveland Stadium.
And finally, number 15. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows was published in the summer of 2007, the same summer the first iPhone model was released. The 7th and last book in the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, was released in 2007, ending the series that began in 1997 with the publication of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
So she did that entire series over the span of 10 years. Hey, George R.R. Martin, what's your problem, dude? Get on these books. Dude's gonna die before he finishes A Song of Ice and Fire.
That same year, something came along that has probably done more to kill children's interest in reading more than anything else: the first iPhone. Considering that the first iPhone seems like a vintage phone now, it's impressive how fast time goes by. And that's exactly
But listen, and I know a lot of you watching this video, you aren't old enough to even really remember a time before smartphones. But this was a big deal at the time because we didn't have phones with apps and all that stuff, right? And we had just only had cell phones for maybe a decade before that, most people. I mean, most people didn't have cell phones in the mid-90s. It's late 90s is when we all started getting cell phones. And at the time, to text, you had to hit the button 3 times, like, you know, each one, and it took forever. And we didn't have apps and all this stuff. And man, has the world changed in 15, 20 years.
Why I included this fact on this list. That was almost 20 years ago, and at least to me this really feels like another era. But that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
All right, so let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Big thank you to Jeremy in San Pedro, California, and Gavin in Cincinnati, Ohio. Enjoy some Skyline chili down there, Gavin. Thank you guys so much for your support. We'll see you again soon.